This is the famous performance by Marilyn Monroe at President Kennedy's birthday. Marilyn had an affair with both the president and his brother, Bobby Kennedy. 3 months after this performance, the actress would be found dead. John Kennedy would be assassinated a year later, and his brother would be shot 5 years after that. The deaths of all three would give rise to numerous mysteries and secrets. What really happened? Who or what killed the most famous actress in the United States at the age of 36, almost at the peak of her career? No one knows the absolute truth, but we will examine the theories. In this video, you'll find a complete biography of the legendary actress. From a shy girl from an orphanage to a treasure of American culture, this will not be a dull biography. Of course, we will talk about the lofty subjects like art, society, and history, but also, for example, we will discuss the intimate photographs of the actress in detail. Right now, I will tell you about the public and private life of the cinema legend. What was she hiding? And who was the actress, model, sex symbol, Marilyn Monroe, really? Even without watching films, everyone knows who Marilyn Monroe is, what she looks like, and what she represents. What is the secret? It would seem that the last film featuring the star was released 60 years ago. Marilyn's acting talent is often questioned, and generally it is said that any blonde with curves could have been in her place. But why is Marilyn Monroe one of the most famous symbols of American culture? The starting point can be considered the year 1953. By that time, Marilyn Monroe was already a fairly well-known actress, but in 1953 she became a true star. That year, the films How to Marry a Millionaire and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes were released. It was from there that the whole world learned that diamonds are a girl's best friend. The films were hugely successful, but what was most important was that iconic image was finally formed. A somewhat silly, naive, yet incredibly attractive blonde with voluptuous shapes. In general, Marilyn Monroe perfectly matched the beauty standards of that time. The 1950s was the first post-war decade. In the United States, there was an economic boom and a baby boom. A married woman with several children was the role model. An hourglass figure with a full bust and a narrow waist was the ideal of femininity. Today, everyone tries to lose weight, but in the 1950s in America, on the contrary, women tried to gain weight. Being skinny was not popular. Advertisements and magazines literally shouted, "Gain weight! Men don't want your bones, add pounds fast." It's clear that forms alone do not make a superstar. An important part of that very image, and indeed Marilyn's charisma, was her unique manner of movement and speech. Directors in various films actively used her famous swaying walk. Marilyn's voice and timbre were completely unique. She spoke softly. At the beginning of her career, this was a big problem. She had to work long with a coach to learn to speak louder. But in the end, the voice became a trademark. And possibly the most significant aspect of Marilyn's allure was the naive expression on her face. Combined with her inherent sexuality, this created a unique effect, attracting male viewers while not alienating the female audience. In the 1950s, the notorious Hays Code was still in effect in America. Essentially, it was a form of state morality censorship. The code prohibited profanity, nudity, and sex in films. It discouraged the depiction of scenes involving violence or immoral behavior, such as very long kisses, especially with a negative character. And these were far from the only restrictions. However, as is well known, you can forbid the depiction of sex on screen. But that does not mean people will stop desiring intimacy with one another. In scenes featuring Marilyn, directors seemingly did not show anything prohibited, yet sexual tension was still present on screen. This was unfailingly effective with audiences. In the year 1955, the film The 7-Year Itch was released, famous for its legendary scene with the dress billowing up. A few years later, the movie Some Like It Hot premiered in cinemas. By the beginning of the 1960s, Marilyn Monroe was perhaps the most famous woman in the world. She was adored both in America and beyond. Millions of people dreamed of speaking with her, touching her, obtaining her phone number. However, within a couple of years, everything would change. She would become lonely and depressed. Early one Sunday morning in August 1962, she was found dead in her own bedroom. At the same time, FBI agents arrived at the local telephone company's office. They seized Marilyn's phone call records, which remain unknown to this day, who she called hours before her death and what happened to the legendary actress, whether it was suicide or murder. To understand, let's start from the beginning. Marilyn Monroe's drama began before she was even born. The actress's mother, Gladys Monroe, worked with film at a Los Angeles studio. Charles Gifford was her boss and boyfriend. On the 1st of June in the year 1926, a baby girl was born, who a couple of decades later the whole world would know as Marilyn Monroe. For the parents, this was not a joyful event. Charles was only recently divorced, had no intention of starting a family, and left upon learning of the pregnancy. Gladys Monroe, by that time, had already had 2 unsuccessful marriages and 2 children, whom she left with her ex-husband. The newborn girl was named Norma Jeane, and that is what she would be called for the first 20 years of her life. In some documents, the mother listed the surname of her first husband, Baker, while in other documents, she listed the surname of her second husband, Mortensen. The surname of Norma Jeane's real father appeared nowhere. Gladys Monroe was 24 years old at the time, still wanted to live her own life, and was not inclined to become a single mother. She already had unfortunate experiences with her first 2 children. Therefore, Gladys decided it would be better if other people raised the little girl. For the first 7 years of her life, Norma Jeane lived with the Bollinger couple, devout and strict people who, besides Norma, were raising several other foster children. The guardians received payments from the state for each of these children. Not only her mother, but also her grandmother, Della Monroe, had refused to raise the girl. At that time, she lived near the guardian's home. When Norma Jeane was 1 year old, her grandmother broke into the Bollingers' house and attempted to smother her 1-year-old granddaughter with a pillow. One of the guardians managed to intervene and called the police. Della Monroe was sent to a psychiatric hospital. She was diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis, known today as bipolar disorder. A month later, Della Monroe passed away. When Norma Jeane was 6, she declared for the first time that she wanted to be an actress. Her guardians, the Bollingers, reacted very negatively to this. They were religious and forbade the children from watching movies. "We go to church, not to the cinema," said the Bollingers. In 1933, when Norma Jeane was 7, her mother decided that she was finally ready for parental responsibilities. She bought a house on credit and took her daughter back. Gladys and Norma furnished the house and bought a beautiful piano. Both felt that a new life had begun. A few months later, Gladys Monroe suffered a nervous breakdown. In the hospital, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She would spend much of her life in psychiatric hospitals. Already a famous actress, Marilyn Monroe would later buy back the piano that stood in the house she shared with her mother and place it in her New York apartment. After the diagnosis of Gladys Monroe, her daughter spent a short time with several foster families and eventually ended up in an orphanage. According to Marilyn's recollections, it was the worst place on earth. She couldn't understand the very fact of being in an orphanage. Norma Jeane hated the daily routine and rules of the orphanage. She claimed that she was constantly bullied. She was a quiet and shy child. It's possible that Marilyn exaggerated and demonized that orphanage. Many of those who worked there noted that it was almost an exemplary place. Perhaps Norma Jeane couldn't bear the very fact that she ended up in an orphanage, and it formed a negative image in her memory. One of Marilyn Monroe's future husbands, playwright Arthur Miller, recalled that throughout her life, she could enter a room and immediately know who among those present had once been in an orphanage. When he asked how she did it, Marilyn responded that there was an endless emptiness and loneliness in every orphan's eyes. In 1937, Grace Goddard, a longtime friend of Norma Jeane's mother, became the girl's official guardian. However, even after this, the girl continued to move from one family to another. She lived first with some relatives, then with others. According to Marilyn's recollections, it was during this time that she experienced abuse. She did not specify a particular person or family. Marilyn was generally the first star to openly talk about the violence she experienced. This fact is disputed, but indirect evidence supports it. Until the end of her life, Marilyn suffered from low self-esteem, could not remain in relationships for long, experienced nightmares, a sense of shame, and suicidal thoughts. All these are often experienced by those who suffered violence in childhood. In the early 40s, Grace Goddard and her family decided to move to another state, and she did not want to take Norma with them. She decided to marry off the girl. Grace found a suitable candidate, literally, in the neighbouring house. James Dougherty, who was 21 at the time, was handsome and worked at an aircraft company. At 16, without finishing school, Norma Jeane got married for the first time. The newlyweds settled in a small house. In the marriage, Norma Jeane felt strange, as if a child was trying to play the role of a model wife. According to both spouses' memories, they were strangers to each other. However, in some sense, this first unsuccessful marriage led Norma Jeane to the start of her Hollywood career. A couple of years into the marriage, James Dougherty got a position as a sailor on a merchant ship and went on a long journey across the Pacific Ocean. The 18-year-old Norma Jeane moved in with his parents. They got her a job at a company that produced radio-controlled airplanes. One day, a photographer came there. He was taking pictures of women at the factories to boost the morale of American Army soldiers. He was the first person to understand that the camera loved Norma Jeane. The girl compiled a portfolio and took it to a modelling agency. In 1945, at the age of 19, Norma Jeane signed her first contract. At that time, the young girl showed no hint of becoming the legendary sex symbol. In the modelling agency, her type was defined as the girl next door, meaning a simple, friendly girl you could easily meet next door. She was very active in modelling. Her photos appeared on the covers of American and international magazines. After some time, the modelling agency convinced her to dye her hair, and Norma Jeane became a blonde. At that time, her husband, James Dougherty, was stationed in Argentina. He got his hands on a magazine with Norma on the cover. "Look, this is my wife," he told the sailors. They, in turn, chuckled incredulously. Thanks to her success in the modelling business, Norma Jeane caught the attention of casting agents from the 20th Century Fox film studio. After several screen tests, she received a one-year contract with a very modest salary. One of the studio heads said that Norma Jeane did not sound like a movie star's name. He proposed the name Marilyn. She took her mother's maiden name. Thus, the actress Marilyn Monroe was born. In 1946, Marilyn was 20 years old. Her husband, James Dougherty, had just returned from a 2-year voyage and expected his wife to resume her domestic duties. However, Norma Jeane had changed not only her name, but also her life plans. She wanted to focus on a career as a film actress. The couple divorced. During the year of her first contract, Marilyn Monroe appeared in several minor roles. After a year, the studio decided not to renew the contract with the young actress. It was then that Marilyn realized the harshness of the industry she had entered. There was no shortage of young, attractive girls there. Now everything depended solely on her. For the young actress without a contract, difficult times began. Sometimes she was offered occasional photo shoots, but at times it was not even enough for food. Alone and without work, Marilyn found herself an interesting pastime. She wore the most form-fitting sweater possible and walked down Hollywood Boulevard, gathering admiring glances from passers-by. She needed attention, needed to be liked by people. Primarily, of course, by men. Even 10 or 20 years ago in Hollywood, there was a practice of getting on screen through the casting couch. Who Harvey Weinstein is, I think everyone knows. Not to mention Hollywood of that time. A time of absolute male dominance in the industry. For a young, pretty girl wanting to make it on screen, there weren't many options. At that time, parties were held in Hollywood, where many influential industry representatives gathered. Young, attractive girls were also present there. Many of them tried to make connections to break into the world of big cinema. Of course, this wasn't done for nothing but implied sex. Marilyn found herself such a patron. He turned out to be an emigrant from Russia, influential producer Joseph, also known as Iosif Schenk. At that time, he was around 70. Thanks to Schenk, Marilyn Monroe signed a 6-month contract with Columbia Studio and got a role in the low-budget musical film Ladies of the Chorus. Marilyn played a secondary character. The film was released in 1948, was unsuccessful, and Columbia did not renew the contract with Monroe. Curiously, in the 50s, when Marilyn became a star, the studio re-released the film, replacing the posters. This time they featured a large image and the name of Marilyn Monroe. The contract with Columbia and Schenk's patronage ended. Marilyn was again without work, and she was in search of a new patron. It turned out to be Johnny Hyde, the vice president of one of the leading talent agencies. He was already over 50 and was obsessed with Marilyn. She became his mistress. Thanks to Hyde's patronage, Monroe received roles in the films The Asphalt Jungle and All About Eve. Both films were successful with audiences and critics. In 1951, both films received multiple Oscar nominations. Marilyn played not the main roles there, but producers and audiences began to notice her. The studio 20th Century Fox signed a new 7-year contract with Marilyn. Under its terms, the actress was initially to receive $500 a week. This was, of course, decent money, but it was no match for the size of the fees of modern Hollywood actors. Thanks to the contract, Marilyn received new, albeit not main but noticeable, roles. Gradually, she was attaining the status of a sex symbol. A significant year in Marilyn's career was the year 1952. It was then that the films Clash by Night and Don't Bother to Knock were released. Both pictures were dramas with thriller elements, marking some of Marilyn Monroe's few serious roles in her career. Watch these films and you will be convinced that she was a fairly good actress. Yes, perhaps not a genius, but certainly not the talentless person some consider her to be. At that time, the 26-year-old Marilyn was not yet a superstar, but she was quite well known. Simultaneously, posters featuring a naked blonde on a red background appeared in barbershops, garages, and men's locker rooms across America. Many recognize this girl as Marilyn Monroe. I cannot show these photos in full as we are on YouTube. Let me just say, there is nothing there that would surprise an internet user these days. But the early 50s were a completely different matter. Back then, it was practically pornography, and for a famous actress, nude photos meant the end of a career. At that time, Playboy magazine did not yet exist. The executives at 20th Century Fox were furious. They urged Marilyn to publicly declare that the photographs did not depict her. However, Monroe acted differently. She publicly admitted that those were her pictures. In an interview, Marilyn explained that some years prior, when she had no job and no money, she posed nude, among other things. It was a very risky move, and the story was the talk of the nation. Never before had the public seen nude photos of a famous actress. Marilyn knew she was already being called a sex symbol, and the nude photographs would only increase interest in the rising star. In short, the girl was smart and bold. The films that were released over the next year, 1953, were incredibly successful. Niagara, How to Marry a Millionaire, and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes shattered box office records. This success was not solely due to the scandalous photos, but they certainly helped. Marilyn Monroe became a superstar and America's leading sex symbol. That same year, the first issue of Playboy magazine was published. Marilyn Monroe was on the cover, and inside was that very photo shoot with the red background. It was well-earned fame for a girl who was always shy and spoke softly, and she had come a long way. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is a musical complete with songs and dances. Marilyn Monroe meticulously refined every movement. She worked with a vocal coach and choreographer. After a whole day of filming, the actress usually continued rehearsing. This is partly why the situation with her salary seemed a glaring injustice. In the film Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, the lead roles were played by Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell. Jane received $150,000 for this work. Marilyn was still under a 7-year contract with 20th Century Fox, under which she was paid $1,500 a week at that time. And this was despite the fact that films featuring Monroe were making tons of money. The bosses at 20th Century Fox refused to renegotiate the contract. Firstly, why pay if you don't have to? Secondly, working with Marilyn was difficult. This started even before her star roles. She often arrived late on set, took many takes, and there was always an acting coach with her on set who monitored her performance and provided remarks. Naturally, most directors did not like this. The major success of light comedies featuring Monroe firmly established her image as a dumb, sexy blonde. The studio operated on the principle of "give me the same but different," and Marilyn received similar roles over and over. The actress's own opinion was of no interest to anyone. Her next project was supposed to be a musical comedy featuring Frank Sinatra. This time, Marilyn decided to act differently. At that moment, she was having an affair with Joe DiMaggio, a legendary baseball player who had already retired. In the early 1950s, he was perhaps as well known in America as Monroe. They got married and flew to Japan, where DiMaggio had some business. At that moment, Marilyn was supposed to be on the set of a new film with Sinatra. However, she flew to the other side of the planet and stubbornly ignored calls and messages from the studio. During the trip, Marilyn Monroe realized the full extent of her own popularity. The plane landed at Tokyo Airport. There, 1,000 Japanese fans awaited Marilyn. The police had difficulty restraining the aggressive crowd. After Japan, Monroe and her husband flew to Korea, where Marilyn was offered the opportunity to perform for soldiers on an American military base. The concert took place outdoors, and it was very cold. Nevertheless, Marilyn was in an open dress. She explained this by saying that this was exactly how the soldiers wanted to see her. For Marilyn, the attention and admiration of the crowd were vitally necessary. Joe DiMaggio had hoped that the problems with the studio and their marriage would make Monroe consider ending her career, but for Marilyn this was impossible. Moreover, it became clear that despite all of DiMaggio's fame, the main star in their marriage was indeed the wife. Disputes and disagreements increased, and eventually the marriage lasted less than a year. Around this period, Marilyn Monroe began to have problems with pills. She had trouble sleeping, and doctors prescribed medications, but she abused pills and alcohol and could appear on set in a completely shattered state. However, this did not greatly interfere with her career at the time. Marilyn managed to convince the studio to revise her contract. Finally, her fees matched her star status, but most importantly, she gained creative freedom. Monroe could choose projects and approve directors, an unthinkable luxury for actors of that time. That very film with Sinatra was never made, but new projects promised much more success. In 1955, the film The 7-Year Itch was released, one of the main works in Marilyn Monroe's career. The story of a middle-aged man obsessed with fantasies about his attractive neighbor. The scene with the billowing white dress became legendary. The film was well received by critics and grossed a significant box office. In the same year, Marilyn Monroe moved across the country to New York. She joined the legendary Lee Strasberg acting studio. There, they taught the Stanislavski system, the art of transformation through understanding the deep emotional experiences of a character. In New York, the actress established her own company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, to work on future projects. All this further proves that despite her on-screen image as a frivolous blonde, in real life she was quite an intelligent person. During this period, Monroe began seeing a psychotherapist. He was able to identify Marilyn's primary psychological issues, including low self-esteem and a constant need for approval from others, a fear of being unnecessary, and an inability to maintain long-term relationships. All of this contrasted sharply with the image of the carefree, attractive blonde known to the general public. In New York, Marilyn began a romance with Arthur Miller, a renowned playwright and recognized intellectual of his time. A year later, they married, and Monroe returned to Los Angeles with her husband to continue working. Over the next few years, Marilyn's mental problems began to manifest more severely. She appeared in several films of varying success. The production of these films was complicated by the star's unstable behavior. Issues with pills and alcohol became apparent, and sometimes the actress was unable to deliver a simple line on set, causing filming to halt. The period from 1956 to 1958 was very difficult in Marilyn's personal life. She became pregnant twice. The first time was an ectopic pregnancy, requiring urgent surgery. A year later, she suffered a miscarriage. Despite all this, Marilyn quickly returned to work to begin shooting a new film. It would become the main and last hit of her career, the famous Billy Wilder film Some Like It Hot. The comedy about two unsuccessful jazz musicians who pretend to be women to play in an all-girl band was not easy to film. Monroe, taking advantage of her star status, demanded that all the other actresses in the film have hair darker than hers. Director Billy Wilder recounted that once Marilyn needed 80 takes to say one line. "Where's that bourbon?" Instead, Marilyn would say, "Where's that whiskey?" or "Where's that bottle?" In short, anything but those three necessary words. However, despite all the disagreements and scandals during filming, the film was an absolute success at the box office. Many critics still consider it the best comedy in the history of cinema. Marilyn Monroe received a Golden Globe Award for her role. This was the peak of the legendary actress's career. Just a few years later, she would die in complete solitude. In the year 1960 and 1961, the last two films featuring Marilyn were released: the musical comedy Let's Make Love and the drama The Misfits. Both films were unsuccessful at the box office and received predominantly negative reviews. Talks began about the end of the Marilyn Monroe era. She was 35, and that naive, somewhat childlike expression that audiences had adored was a thing of the past. Maintaining her status as a sex symbol was becoming increasingly difficult. During the filming of her last two movies, she heavily abused pills and alcohol. Marilyn ended up in the hospital directly from the set. Working with her became nearly impossible. Around that time, she divorced Arthur Miller. For a brief period, Marilyn managed to pull herself together. She changed her hairstyle and slimmed down. And although Monroe understood that the time had come to change her image, she couldn't stop being that same blonde. Today, in such a situation, celebrities undergo plastic surgery. Early in her career, Marilyn had a minor operation on her chin, but otherwise at that time surgical possibilities were greatly limited. Doctors could not rejuvenate a person. For example, implants were not yet practiced. In June of 1962, Marilyn had a famous photo shoot for Vogue magazine. Initially, the photographer took several quite revealing pictures. Marilyn was very upset with the result. She didn't like how she and her body looked. Ultimately, a new photo with an entirely different image was taken for the magazine. Despite all the difficulties in the last years of her life, Monroe managed to make an impression on those around her, particularly men. Besides several marriages, she had affairs with major sex symbols, not only of America but of the world: Frank Sinatra, Marlon Brando, Yves Montand. In this context, an affair with President John Kennedy does not seem far-fetched. They met at several events in the early 1960s. Kennedy had a reputation as a playboy. Rumors of the president's numerous affairs constantly circulated in elite circles. Among modern biographers of Marilyn Monroe, there is practically no doubt that in the 1960s she had a liaison first with John Kennedy and then with his brother Bobby. Many who knew Monroe and Kennedy at the time confirmed the information about the affair. The most compelling argument of opponents of this version is the lack of documentary evidence, such as photographs. But the early 60s was a completely different time. Not everyone had a camera phone in hand, and photojournalists were not in a hurry to chase hot photos of the president and his mistress. The unwritten ethical rules of journalism were entirely different. No respectable magazine would have published those photos. For serious publications, reporting on the adulteries of high-ranking individuals was unethical. The famous photo of an embracing couple where the woman resembles Monroe and the man appears to be one of the Kennedys is a fake. The only confirmed photograph capturing both brothers and Marilyn was taken at a party after a concert, which would go down in history thanks to one performance. It was a major event dedicated to John Kennedy's birthday. Marilyn Monroe interrupted filming in Los Angeles to fly to New York for a single performance. It was after this event that many confidently spoke of an affair between Marilyn and the president, although in reality their relationship was coming to an end. After that evening, the Kennedy brothers began to distance themselves from Marilyn. Rumor has it that this was insisted upon by the president's wife, Jackie Kennedy. A major blow to Marilyn Monroe was being fired from the movie Something's Got to Give. It was from this set that she flew to New York for the Kennedy party. Marilyn frequently disrupted work and was unable to appear on set. Because of this, filming had to be postponed. The dismissal took place almost immediately after Marilyn turned 36. In recent years, she often stated her age as 2 separate digits, as if she was afraid to say the full number out loud. On the 5th of August 1962, 3 months after her birthday, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her bedroom. On that fateful night, the housekeeper first raised the alarm. At midnight, she left the guest house and noticed that the light was on in Marilyn's bedroom. She knocked, but hearing no response, called the psychiatrist who attended to the actress. Upon arriving, he broke the window into Marilyn's bedroom and found her dead, clutching a telephone receiver in her hand. The sudden death of the superstar was a shock for the entire country. Most Americans were entirely unaware of the dramas occurring in Marilyn's life. Her death raised many questions and mysteries. The intelligence services seized records of Marilyn's phone calls that night, whom she called remains unknown. The psychiatrist initially claimed he arrived shortly after midnight, but the police were only called 4 hours later. What occurred during those few hours in Marilyn Monroe's bedroom? Who else was in the actress's house that night? Bobby Kennedy officially spent the entire day of the 4th of August in San Francisco. However, there were several witnesses who claimed they saw the president's brother in Los Angeles that day. Why, then, did he lie about his whereabouts? There was a hypothesis that the death of Marilyn involved the intelligence services and the Kennedy brothers. Because of this, in the 80s, the investigation into the actress's death was even reopened. However, no evidence of violent death was found. Both Kennedy brothers were killed within several years after Monroe's death. This only added to the mystique. Yet in reality, the events were not related to each other. Most of the actress's biographers are also not inclined to consider what happened on that fateful night as murder. For if one closely examines the full biography of Marilyn Monroe, the version of suicide seems the most likely. In the star's family, there were many people with mental illnesses. She herself was a shy, lonely girl, abandoned by her parents. Marilyn spent her whole life seeking approval and attention from those around her. She never succeeded in building a family or having children. By her mid-30s, she understood that she was losing the looks that had brought her popularity. The world was rapidly changing, the 60s had arrived, and the new era demanded new heroes and symbols. However, almost 60 years later, it can be said with certainty that the legendary blonde was something much more than just a famous actress. The history of cinema has seen many stars, but there was only one Marilyn Monroe,